We're going to go ahead and we're going to work with formatting tables, and we're going to talk about using tables the right way. XHTML tables have seen a lot of use in the history of the web. They were originally created to display data in a spreadsheet-like format, and they basically then became a more popular layout tool because of the limitations of HTML and XHTML. Designers simply got creative and used table rows and columns to be able to position page elements on a page and to create things like sidebars, footers, headers, navigation, etc. CSS obviously does a much better job laying out a web page, and it also cleans up your code quite a bit. So now, using tables, you can concentrate on using and formatting tables for their original purpose, which is basically to display data in a tabular type fashion. The page that we're going to be working on, and we'll come back and look at the code in just a moment, is basically a table that talks about the different table tags. And as you see, this is what it looks like on the page. If I shorten my web browser here a little bit, it basically looks like this. Let me just turn off my navigation toolbar to make a little bit more room. And it's pretty darn ugly. You can see that the text is right against the borders, and I just turned on the borders so we could kind of see what they look like. That's pretty much the only formatting that I have on the table, and that's done via XHTML, but I turned on the borders so you could see where the borders are located in the tables. But this information is not particularly easy to read. There's not enough spacing. The info is just crammed in there, and we're going to go ahead and use CSS to make this information look much, much, much nicer. So let's go ahead and look at our XHTML document that we're going to be working with. I basically just have our empty style tag waiting for some styles, which we'll be making shortly. I go ahead and I've defined my table, and as I said before, I just defined border, cell spacing, and cell padding. That's the only formatting assigned to the table, and we'll be getting rid of the border in just a moment. The table begins by displaying a caption. The caption is up here at the top of our table. And you can see that the caption appears above. And basically, the advantage of using a caption in your page is, first of all, it helps a lot with usability. It also allows you to define the table caption, so you can specify something at the top of your table that's defining it as, you know, what that table group is about. So I've opened a caption tag, and then I have inserted a column group tag, which has column IDs for the various columns that we're going to be using. We're using 3 columns, what I'm calling tags, descriptions, and additional for additional information. And pretty much the reason that you use column group is it's a really easy way to define, like I find it most useful because it's useful in setting the widths of the columns without having to set the widths for particular cells. And you can use the same setting for a series of tables and be sure that relevant columns are going to line up. So if you have multiple tables on your page, this can definitely help, even if the amount of content in the cell varies. By default, when the amount of content in a cell varies, if you don't define any sort of width values, then the table is going to expand and shrink around the content. So that can definitely become helpful. The next tag that we have is we have our T head tag here, and basically the T head tag allows us to group the table header. It's like a table header group, and it basically allows us to group the header. Usually comes right after the caption, and it usually is bold, so anything within the TH tag, as opposed, you know, it's surrounding the normal TR tag, which is your table row tag. But you can see that these text up here in my TH tag, my T head tag, are going to appear bold. So that's a useful way to be able to apply styles directly to that portion of the web page. Then I've defined my T body, which basically is going to contain the body portion of my page, and inside there I just have a series of rows and table cells which basically contain the content. I have some non-breaking spaces because not all of my cells are filled with information, as you can see right here, and I need to put something in there just to hold that table cell open. So that's pretty much the formatting of the table. After I close the table tag down here, I simply have a paragraph tag that has a link. So we'll go ahead and we'll style that as well. So let's get started styling our page so that it looks much better. I'm going to begin by creating a style for my body tag. So I'll just start by opening a style for body, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to define attributes for the color of my text, and I'm going to use a non-safe web color, which is perfectly fine these days, so I can feel free to get creative and use things that are outside of the norm. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to define a font family. And the font family that I want to use in this example is, I'm going to actually define request anyways, Trebuchet, which is a really nice font, and it should be installed by default on most people's systems. But here is a case where, in case they don't have Trebuchet MS, I certainly want to specify an alternate font. So I'm going to go ahead and request Arial and then just a generic sans serif. I'm going to go ahead and set the font size for everything in our page. So we'll specify font size, and I'm going to use M's. I'm going to define my font size to be 0.69 M's, and then I'm going to also define a background color to my page. So I'll go ahead and set the background color, and I'm going to use a non-web safe value again, and we'll take a look at this in just a moment. Alrighty, so I've defined what I want my body to look like. I'm going to come and refresh my page, and you can see that now I have this kind of like greenish gray color as my background. My text is much smaller, and now you can see most of the table on the page without having to scroll down anymore. So my table still needs help because it's not very legible, so let's go ahead and define some of those attributes next. I'm going to first of all define an attribute for my A tag, and I'm not going to go about defining a link, a visited, a active, a hover, and all that good stuff. I'm just going to generically define the color for the A tag, just to make it kind of go with the rest of the design that we'll be using here. And this just is kind of a red color, so I only have this one link down here. If I reload my page, you can see it's like an orangey red, and when I hover, visit, whatever, it's always going to stay the same because I'm just defining it generically for the A tag. Generally, I usually like to define things for the other tags, but since this particular exercise is not really so concerned with setting definition for the other tags in our exercise, I'm not going to worry about that so much right now. So the next thing I want to do is I want to actually come and I want to get rid of the border that's in my table. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this. And in its place, I'm going to go ahead and assign my table an actual ID. And I'm going to call my table's ID my table. So if we refresh in the browser, you're going to see that all the border elements are going to disappear, but the information is still being displayed as in tabular formatting. It isn't very easy to read right now. It even gets worse without the borders, but we'll be fixing this up shortly. So the next style that I'm going to define is going to be for my table. I'm going to set a fixed width, and I'm also going to remove any padding and margin attributes that might be associated with my table by default. So I'm going to make a style for my table, and we'll come into the tag right here, and we're going to set the width value, and I'm going to use a pixel width value. And then I'm going to go about setting both my padding and my margins to 0. Alrighty, so if we save and we refresh, we're not going to see really that much of a difference, even that everything is more squished together, and the information has shrunk a little bit because my browser window is slightly larger than 700 pixels right now. So now let's come back in here and let's start to define some widths for the columns. So because I used, as I explained before, my column group tag and assigned IDs to the 3 columns that are being used, I can go ahead and I can define styles for each of those. So I'm going to type my table space tag is the first one. And I'm going to go ahead and just use percent values to define the widths for these things. So I'm going to set the width for that first column to be 10%. And I'm just going to copy paste this since the other two styles are going to basically be the same, with the exception that I will change the name of the ID to the appropriate ID. So my next one is called description, and we're going to go ahead and just set the description to 60%. So I'll just change that to 60%. And then the last one that I have is called additional, and I'm going to go ahead and set the width for additional to 30%. So if I save my page now and we refresh, you're going to see that the information has kind of divided itself up and moved over. So now, of the 700 pixel width table, only 10% is being used for the first column, and it doesn't need to be very wide because I don't have very much information. I'm going ahead and assigning 60% to this portion and then 30% for this over here. My table still needs some help, so we'll go ahead and we'll come back into our code view and we'll start to define some of the other attributes of the table. And the next part that I want to define is I'm going to go ahead and define my table headers. So I'm going to go ahead and use my th tag as a element that I can style. If we look down here, you can see that all of my th inside my table header, I'm using th tags. I'm also using the scope. Scope is basically an attribute that defines whether a header cell provides header information for a column or a row. And scope is an attribute that is really helpful in making sure that your table makes sense to a non-visual browser. The attribute defines whether the header cell holds information for a column, and you would use basically scope column like I'm using here, or for a row, and you would be using scope equals and then in quotes row. So you can go ahead and use scope if you like. It definitely is something that you probably want to use if you want to make your page compliant. So I'm going to go ahead and define values for my th tag as I was beginning to do before. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use a shorthand method of defining some different attributes about my font. I'm going to go ahead and define my font as being bold. I'm going to go ahead and request that the user display in trebuchet MS, and I'll put that in quotes, and let's just capitalize this. And then I'm going to go ahead and type comma, and I'll type my Arial, and then I'll type my sans serif as a last option. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to define the color. So the color that I'm going to be using has a hex value of 4FB, 6B actually, 72. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set some borders for the various portions of my page. So I'm going to use border dash right, and I'm going to go ahead and set this to 1 pixel. It's going to be a solid line, and then I'll define a color for it. And I'm just going to copy this line once I have it. And I'm going to go ahead and also define a border bottom. So I'll change this to bottom. And I'm going to go ahead and do a border top. And my border right, bottom, and top right now are all set to the same. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to define a border for the left as well. But I'm going to change the color on the left to display as a white, and this will just help when we go ahead and put in our background colors and stuff. So let's just save this and take a look at what we have so far. If I refresh my page, you can see that I'm starting to get a border that appears around these cells. The text, of course, has already been defined. It's displaying as bold, but I do get this border, and on the left edge I get a little white line, which I think just adds a nice kind of almost like a beveled touch to my web page. Let's go ahead and let's take these letters and space them out a little bit. So I'm going to use a letter spacing of 2 pixels. We'll just use a fixed value for that. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my text transform property, and I'm going to tell the text in my header to display as uppercase. And then we'll go ahead and I'm going to do a text align. So I want to align my text to appear on the left edge. Left align my text. And I'm going to add a little bit of spacing in my table header. So I'm going to go ahead and add padding, and I will use the shortcut of 6px space 6px. I'm using 6 pixels, 6px, and then I want to add a little more pixels on the bottom, so I'm going to go ahead and display 12px here. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll set the background. Oops, what happened there? Let's try that again. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and set the background, and I'm going to go ahead and set the background color, and I'm going to use a value of CAE 8EA, which is this kind of light teal blue. And I also have a background image which I want to be using as well. So I've went ahead and prepared a background image that I want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and specify that my background image be set. And remember, when you're setting background image, you're going to type URL, then you're going to type opening parentheses, you're going to type the path to the file, and mine is called bg_header.jpg. It's a slight gradiated image, and I'm going to also specify that I want to repeat in the X value. So I guess it would be helpful if I spelled the extension correctly. JPEG. Let's go ahead and save, and let's refresh and see what we get. You can see that now it's displaying this, and basically what it's doing is it's filling this section of my web page with these this image. And actually, let me check my image really fast, because let's go ahead and let's just set the repeat over here. Repeat, and we'll repeat in X. Because I didn't shorthand this, I think I need to go ahead and define each one. Yeah, there's my background image. My background image is just a gradiated image that starts with a white and then transfers down to this darker color. But you can see how the formatting on this header has definitely improved somewhat, making it a little bit more legible. As soon as we define some of our other attributes, our table is going to clean up quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and set attributes for my TD tags, which are basically all cell tags. Let's go ahead and use a border right. So I'm going to specify border right, and I will make it 1 pixel solid. And I'm going to go ahead and choose a color, and the color I'm using is this color right here. I'm going to go ahead and use a semicolon. I will go ahead and copy this and paste it in, and I'm just going to change border right to border bottom. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come ahead and set the padding, and I'm going to use my shorthand. I'm going to use 6 pixels. Actually, I guess we already have this defined up here. I'll just copy this line since I'm using the same values as I used in my header. So 6 pixels, 6, 6, and then 12 all the way around. And I'm going to set the text color for my table cells as well. And we'll go ahead and use a text color that is kind of a darker teal color is what I want to use. Alright, so if I save now and we refresh, you can see what my table looks like now. So again, much easier to use. I did not want to define a border on the left edge because I would get double borders that are going to appear, and then this line would be twice as thick. If I set borders on the left, right now I have borders on the right, so this cell would have the border on the right and on the left, and that line would appear just twice as thick. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to use a class to be able to set the borders over here. So we'll come back to that, but you can see already that the table information is much easier to discern. It's much easier to see what's going on in our table. So let's go ahead and let's continue to style a couple of different attributes here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set up a style for a class, and I'm going to be setting some classes momentarily. We'll set up our style first. So this is going to be called TD row, and basically in my TD row I have a border left that I want to set, and I'm going to go ahead and set my left border to 1 pixel solid, and I'm going to go ahead and set my color to that same teal color that I'm using elsewhere on my table. I'm going to go ahead and set the font, actually our font size should be okay. Let's set our font weight. And I'm going to go ahead and define that the font weight in these first cells that I'm going to define be set to bold so they stand out a little bit. We're going to also set our font style. And my font style that I want to be using here is going to be italic. So I'm setting these to bold and italic. I'm going to set the background color to white, and I've prepared an image here as well, so I'm going to go ahead and set the background image, and my background image is going to be URL, open my parentheses, type the path to my image, and my image is called arrow1.gif, close my parentheses, semicolon. I'm going to tell that I do not want my background image to repeat. So I'm going to say repeat is set to no repeat. And finally, we're going to go ahead and position the background image that I'm using. So I'm going to use background position. And I'm going to set the background position to left bottom. So it's going to align it to the left and the bottom of the particular cell that we're going to be defining. And let's go ahead and let's set the color of the font as well. So I'm going to specify the color of my font be set to a color that is a contrasting color here. We're going to go ahead and use kind of like this dirty orange, yellowish shade. So when I save and I refresh, obviously nothing's going to happen because I assigned this to be a class. So in order to see these things that we've actually assigned, I need to go into my code and I need to go ahead and set the class, assign the class anyway, to some of our different rows. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set one more style that's going to be associated with the rows so that I can apply these together. So I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to set another style. This one's going to be called TD dot, actually let's not assign this to a TD, we'll just make a class row BG for background. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just do something really simple here. I'm going to set the background color to white. Alright, so now let's go down here and let's go ahead and assign this. What we want to have happen in, and this is commonly used when you're formatting tables, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to set up another class momentarily, but we want our table to have alternating cell colors just to make it a little bit easier to read. So this is basically going to be the definition for, you know, like the even or odd row, and then we'll go ahead and we'll make a definition for the next row that we want to use. So here's the first row that I want to assign this to. It's basically the first row that appears. I'm going to go ahead and set my class, and this is going to be set to row BG. So if I save my page and we refresh, you can see that this first cell now has a background color of white. Now I've made a special class that I want to affect the first column of this row. I want this to be bold and I want it to stand out a little bit more. We've set a background image and things like that. So I'm going to come to this first cell and I'm going to set this cell to be set to row. And if I save and we refresh, you can see that now the text has changed. It's bold, it's italic. I have this little triangle that appears at the bottom of the table, and the table is definitely starting to be polished. So every other row is going to take on this style. So the next one is going to be the row that contains information about column group. I'm going to have to come to the row first and set the class to be row BG, and then I'm going to come to that first cell and set the class be set to row. And the next one I think is going to be, let's find the next row down here that starts. So here's the next row. This is an alternating one, so I won't assign anything to that. I'll come down to this one right here and assign a class of row BG, and then the first cell is going to have a class of row. And let's just see if we have another one. So here's one that we'll skip for now. We have one more down here. I think this is the last one that'll take on this row class that we made. Yeah, that should be it. So let's save and we'll refresh. And you can see that now every other cell in my table takes on the attributes that we define. So this looks much better. We do need to add a little bit of extra to these kind of, I guess this would be the even cells. So let's go ahead and let's make a new style so that we can style those as well. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come in here, and just for the sake of making things easier, I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste these, because I'm just going to basically be using the same formatting but changing a couple of things. So I'll paste these in. We're going to go ahead and we're going to call the pasted one row alt. So this is for the alternating row, and we'll call this one down here row BG alt. Actually, let's call it row alt BG, because that's easier to read. I'll just set this because this is only going to have one attribute. It's going to have a background color. So I'll just go ahead and define that right now. And then we'll go about making the changes that we want to appear here. My border left is going to be the same, so I'm not going to change anything there. I do want the text to be bold and italic, so I'm not going to change anything there. My background color is going to change to be this same hex value, so instead of white, I'm going to change it to this color, which is kind of a light teal, I guess you could call it, a light turquoise. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set my image to arrow2.gif. I also want it to not repeat, but we'll change the position of this one to left, but let's go ahead and let's try putting it on the top of this cell. So I'm going to set that to left top. And finally the color is going to change. So I'm going to change the value here to be the color that I want. So let's go ahead and let's assign this new class to the alternating rows. We'll come down in here and we'll find the first alternating row that we have. So let's set our class. Our class for here is going to be row alt BG. This is going to set our background color, and then the class for the first cell is going to go ahead and be set to row alt. So let's just check that out real quick so you can see what's happening. If I refresh, you can now see that this cell has an alternating color. I've kind of made this little background image just to kind of create an interesting graphical element, and you can see that these elements stand out because they're bold and italicized. So this is making our table much easier to read. Let's go ahead and apply these settings to the rest of the cells and rows. So I'm just going to come down here and I'm going to define a class for the rows here, and I'm going to assign a class for the first column. And we'll go ahead and scroll down a little bit. Here's my next row. And here's my first cell. And again, I think I have one more, yes. And the last one is going to be right here. Alrighty, let's save this and let's take a look at our table. You can see that now my table looks like this. So all of a sudden my information gets much easier to read. It's much easier to see what's going on in the table. The one thing that I'd like to do is move this text over here to the right. So let's just change that real quick. We can go ahead and add a style for that. That text, which basically talks about what's going on, is my caption right there. So this is actually located within the caption tag. So all I need to do basically is set a style for the caption, and I guess I forgot to do that initially. So let's go ahead and let's go back into the HTML code and let's set a style for the caption. I'm just going to create this right under my table because it seems like it's going to make more sense to do it there. I'm just going to target a tag, so all I need to do is put the tag, opening and closing curly braces as we've done many times before. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set the padding. And the padding that I'm going to use, I'll use the shorthand method of specifying 0 for my top. I'm going to set 3 pixels for the right, 5 pixels for the bottom, and the left will be set to 0 as well. And then what we'll do is we'll set the width of the caption, and I'm going to use the same width as I used on my table, 700 pixels. I'm going to come ahead and I'm going to set the font to be the font style that I want to use, and here I'll use shorthand on the on specifying the font. I'm going to go ahead and specify that it's italic. I'm going to go ahead and specify that I want to use Georgia, and if that's not available, I'll take the default serif font, and I'm going to go ahead and use text align right to get that on the right hand side. So let's save and let's refresh. There we go, that looks a little bit better right there. Alrighty, so this is an example of how you can usefully use a table and CSS to make the table much more user-friendly. All of your styling attributes are located within the styles that you've defined for the page, and you basically have still kept the content area of your website, the markup area of your website, really light and just straight to the point. So this is a great way to use tables successfully and to also be able to create a site that is user-friendly for both non-seeing and seeing users. I do have a link on this page. If you want to find more information about tables, you can go ahead and visit the W3 website, and this talks all about the different table tags. And there's just a plethora of information here. So if you're not that familiar with some of the tags that I've used, it talks about them. It also talks about things that I didn't use in this table, but you certainly could, and then you could style them, like the T-foot. I didn't use that because I didn't create a footer for my table, but it does talk about column groups and captions and things that, you know, if you're not that familiar with them, you can get more information. So that'll be available for you in the page, and I think you clearly agree that this looks much better than what we started with. So hopefully that kind of sums up how to successfully use tables within your web pages. This is a good example of how you would want to display information and make it more organized using tables.